A reading from Isaiah. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots on the threshold shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me! I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here am I, send me. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
This is from Luke 5, 1 through 11. Once, while Jesus was standing beside the lake of Gennesaret, and the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he saw 2 boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little way from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch. Simon answered, Master, we've worked all night long, but we've caught nothing. If you say so, I will let down the nets. When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boats to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats, so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down to Jesus' knees, saying, Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of the fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people. When they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
It gets me every time. That hymn, that we sang to open the service, Holy, Holy, Holy. It's actually my wife Kim's favorite hymn. You should know why, because it's the hymn that we sang on the very first Sunday that we were here and I was your pastor nearly 30 years ago. The sanctuary was packed full, just like this morning, don't you know? Yeah, well, it was only one service back then, remember. Well, we just come from Mobile, Alabama, where the church I served had about 200 people when the sanctuary was full. And when we sang Holy, Holy, Holy that day, the hair really went right up on the back of my neck, and I fought back tears. Kim says that what she felt was at the same time both awe and dread. The feeling was overwhelming that she was caught up in something bigger than she had ever known, and it made her wonder if she and we were up to it. Well, that's not so different from what Isaiah probably felt long ago when he first heard that holy, holy, holy. Probably not so different from what Peter felt in our gospel reading too, when he had his encounter with the Holy One. You know, every once in a while, and never on demand. You get an epiphany. It's kind of a gift of being in the right place at the right time when the veil between heaven and earth is so thin that you can see the angels among us, and you have this sense of the presence of God, a sense that is probably always there, but we usually miss it. But it's a sense that both delights you and scares the bejeebers out of you. But before it's over, it changes you. Because I'm not afraid of being too corny, as you know, I'm going to describe the movement and the range of this experience this morning with 3 homonyms that play off the seraphim's holy, 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 right? You see how it's spelled in my sermon title. When we have a true encounter with God, it's God's holiness we experience. That is God's otherness or grandeur or glory. And then when we get over the shock and awe of it, we become aware of our own holiness. That is to say, our unholiness. The fact that we are unworthy and sinful. But God never leaves us there. We always end up being forgiven and restored and commissioned to live anew for God in some surprising way. So let's start with the first holy, God's holiness. When Isaiah sees this vision of God, we don't know exactly where he is, probably in the temple. It's about the year 740 BCE. King Uzziah has just died. He had reigned in Judah for more than 50 years. And can you imagine that Isaiah and all the people were anxious about what would come next? The Assyrian Empire was threatening, as they always did, And no one knew whether the new king, Jotham, would be a good king or a bad king. In that moment, God reveals God's self to Isaiah as if to reassure him and the people that the real king is on the throne, even if behind the scenes of history. We don't know, like I said, where Isaiah was when he saw God high and lifted up. He was probably in the temple, but whether he was there or not, it didn't matter because he saw God in the temple, the divine robe flowing, the hem of the garment filling the temple, and the temple stood for the whole earth. It was a microcosm. If God was filling the temple, then God was present everywhere in the world because the temple in Jerusalem was the center of everything. Seraphs were flying around, the king of the universe. These angelic figures had 6 wings. Ever seen one? I don't know. We're told about them. With 2 of them, they covered their face so that they could not look upon the radiance of the face of God. Right? With 2 of them, they covered their feet, which is actually a euphemism for covered their private parts. Who knew angels had private parts, right? With 2 of them, they flew. And they sang to one another the Sanctus. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. This passage and another similar one in the book of Revelation are the inspiration for the hymn, Holy, Holy, Holy. And the reason, by the way, for 3 holies is interesting too. It's because the Hebrew language does not have comparatives or superlatives, so it uses repetition. So if you want to say holier, you say holy, holy. If you want to say holiest, you say holy, holy, holy. See? Which is to say, God is the holiest being of all. God's holiness means God's uniqueness, God's distinctness, not God's distance, though. God is above all, but present with all and in all. And this is where we get confused. It's right to emphasize what the great Danish preacher and philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once called the infinite qualitative difference between God and humanity. Yes, God is God and we are not. There is one God. And that's especially true, something we need to hear and be reminded of at times of personal and political turmoil, when it feels like things are falling apart and we are fearful about the future. Sensing God's holy presence in the whole earth is a sense of relief that no matter how badly we screw up or our political leaders screw up, God hasn't left the room. God is still on the throne. So when we talk about God's holiness, we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking about it as God's being unapproachable. The seraphs shield their face from God's glory, and too often we think that's because no one can look upon the face of God and live, because God is holy and we are not, and if we look upon the face of God, we will die. The point of looking upon the face of God is that we can't control God. We can't look at God as if to say, I see you, and then I should be able to get what I want from you. The point is that God's holiness is such that God cannot be controlled by any other power but God's self. God is completely self-controlled, and that means God can do whatever God wants to do. God's only controlled by the limits God places on God's self, and there really is only one limit: limitless love. God's power is the power of God's love, not the other way around. Michigan Congressman John Dingell died this week at the age of 92. He was the longest-serving congressman in U.S. history, 60 years. It was fun to read that he dictated to his wife a letter to America, the last thing he wanted us to know. And among the things he said apply broadly, in fact, even with little humor. In my life, he said, in my career, I've often heard it said that so-and-so has real power, as in the powerful Wile E. Coyote, chairman of the Capture the Roadrunner Committee. I don't know where he got that. It's an expression that has always grated on me, he said. In democratic government, elected officials do not have power. They hold power in trust for the people who elected them. Now, we might assume that's true for everyone except God. You know, God, unique among us all as the Holy One, has power, since God is God and is the only holy, 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 right? It's true that we don't grant God power or elect God to be God. But I think, and this is the really remarkable thing about God, the God of the Bible, and if we would learn about it ourselves, since we are created in the image and likeness of God, it would change everything for the better. And here it is. Even God holds power rather than having power. That is, God's power always and only serves the purposes of God's love for people. It's what enables God to accomplish whatever God's love for us demands. Which leads to the second homonym of holy, Holey, H-O-L-E-Y. When we encounter the Holy One, who is completely holy, we become aware of our own unholiness. Isaiah sees the vision of God and says, "Woe is me, I'm done for. I'm lost. I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among people of unclean lips. And Peter, when he experiences the presence of God in Jesus, after Jesus, who is not a fisherman, tells Peter, who is a fisherman, where to fish and how to fish, and he catches so many fish that it nearly breaks the boat, and Peter realizes this is a God thing because God is present in Jesus. Peter says, "Go away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man." When we experience the powerful presence of God, it's a good and right thing for us to feel our unworthiness. Unclean, sinful, unable on our own to stand in the presence of God. It's not the right thing for us to look around and compare ourselves to other people. It's right for us to compare ourselves to God and realize we don't compare. Many years ago, the Times of London ran a series of letters to the editor on the subject, "What's wrong with the world?" And they invited people to send in their ideas about what's wrong with the world. And many highly respected people wrote their views. They were printed and avidly read day by day by thousands of readers. And one day, a letter appeared from the great Christian writer G.K. Chesterton to the editor. "You ask what is wrong with the world. I am. Yours sincerely, G.K. Chesterton." Chesterton's letter ended the correspondence. Everyone realized he'd hit the nail on the head. It wasn't just him. It was the idea that it's not other people, it's me. It's a nail we can't seem to find much these days in our time. The news out of Virginia gets worse and worse. The governor, appeared in blackface. It was put in his medical school yearbook. He apologized. Then he backtracked, saying he didn't think it was really a photo of him. The photo that was on his page, mind you. The lieutenant governor there stands accused of sexual assault by 2 different women. He denies the claims, and the hits go on and on. They're trying to figure out how to get these people out of office now because they won't admit their guilt and step down. But there's one thing they haven't quite figured out, and that is, even if they got them out of office, how far down the ladder of succession do you have to go before you can find somebody sinless enough to fill those seats? See, part of the problem in our society is we can't confess our sin because we don't have a cultural mechanism to redeem sinners. Confess your sin, and you get branded forever. You get driven out of the public. You get to wander about bearing your shame forever. No wonder nobody wants to admit anything. If that's the only choice they have, we need to learn the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt says, I did bad. Shame says, I am bad. Guilt is a good thing. Shame is a bad thing. Guilt comes from sinning. Shame from believing there's no recourse to guilt. Guilt can be confessed and forgiven, making you whole again. Shame believes that you are incapable of being forgiven, which then leads you instead to other strategies of denying your own sin and guilt, and that will corrupt your soul. And I tell you, damaged people damage people. Guilt is a proper spiritual response to seeing yourself as you are when you're confronted by the holiness of God. Your instinct is to feel doomed and to run away and hide in fear. But here's the good news. There's another strategy. There's another homonym. That is Holey. W-H-O-O-O-L-L-Y. The moment Isaiah confesses his sinfulness, God sends a seraph to touch a hot coal to his lips as if to forgive his sin and make it possible for him to speak for God. The moment Peter confesses his sinfulness, Jesus tells him not to be afraid. In other words, our feelings of guilt and unworthiness are never the last word about us. Not with God. They are only the opportunity for God to make us whole. And being made whole means that every impediment to our service in the world is now removed. We are able to serve. Rick Curry died a few years ago, but not before living a remarkable life. He was born without a right arm. His father, every year on his birthday, promised him he would get him a new arm. Finally, Rick said to his dad, "Am I not enough as I am?" His mother once took him to see a relic of St. Francis Xavier in Philadelphia, a relic of the saint's preserved right forearm. She encouraged him to kiss the glass of the reliquary in hopes that a miracle would happen and he would grow an arm. His sister, who would become a nun sometime later, came over to him and said, "I'm glad the prayer didn't work. I like you just the way you are." When he was in college at NYU, some of his friends figured out how they could make a little extra spending money by going and auditioning for commercials. And so he joined them one day to audition for a mouthwash commercial. He never got past the front desk because the receptionist laughed at him at the very thought that they would ever cast a one-armed man in a commercial. His humiliation didn't defeat him, though. He went straight from there to figure out what he could do, and he created an acting school in a Soho loft for handicapped persons, and later served wounded veterans. When he was 66, he received a papal dispensation to become a priest, something he needed because there were no one-armed priests. They figured you needed two arms to be able to celebrate a mass. He did it. And when asked why he became a priest, he told the story of the day a really angry veteran, a triple amputee, had burst into his office and asked him for absolution. I explained that I was a brother and had never been called to be a priest, he said, and the man asked, "What do you mean? Who has to call you?" And I said, "God or the Christian community?" And he replied, "Well then, I'm calling you. I want you to be a priest." And so he did. Despite his disability, he never lost faith. At 6, he recalled, because of my arm, I was told I could not be a soldier. I could not be a priest. I could not be a doctor. Well, I have a doctorate, I am a priest, and I'm working with the military. I think that's proof that it's not smart to limit God. Holy, holy, holy. I don't care how you spell it, it sounds the same. And it's the sound, I tell you, of God calling you to serve. For heaven's sake and ours. Don't let fear hold you back. Amen.